Adrian Cole was walking down Maple Avenue in the middle of a quiet Tuesday afternoon, carrying everything he owned from that hospital. Then the sky cracked open with the thunder of rotor blades. 3 black helicopters descended onto the empty field beside the road. Men in tactical gear hit the ground running, and the first one to reach Adrian grabbed his arm and shouted, "Are you Dr. Cole? We need you right now!" Adrian had been a trauma surgeon for 16 years, and in that time, he had learned that hospitals run on 2 things: skill and nerve. Skill to do what textbooks said was impossible. Nerve to do it anyway, when the monitor was screaming and the room had gone quiet. He had both, and for a long time that was enough. Mercy General had been his hospital in every way that mattered, not because he owned it, but because he had bled for it, stayed late for it, and made decisions inside its walls that no committee would have approved and no administrator would have understood. He was not a complicated man. He had been married once, and that had ended, the way most things end, when one person gives everything to a job and the other person finally gets tired of waiting. No bitterness about it. Now just a clean, empty apartment on Fletcher Street and a habit of arriving at the hospital before sunrise because there was nothing at home worth staying for. His whole life had narrowed itself down to one corridor, one operating room. One simple rule. If a person was still breathing when they came through that door, his job was to make sure they kept breathing. Everything else was noise. For 16 years, that rule had been enough. Then Victoria Halstead arrived. She came in on a Monday morning in early spring, the kind of morning that still had a bite in the air, and by noon, she had already rearranged the executive floor and scheduled meetings with every department head. Adrian had his the following Thursday. He sat across from her in a glass-walled office that still smelled like fresh paint, and within 5 minutes, he understood exactly what kind of director she was going to be. She spoke in numbers. Reimbursement rates, average procedure costs, length of stay metrics, revenue per patient ratios. She had a way of delivering those numbers that made them sound like facts of nature, like gravity, like something no reasonable person would argue with. Adrian was not always a reasonable person. He asked her somewhere around the 15-minute mark what she planned to do about the trauma cases that didn't fit neatly into a reimbursement category. Complex polytrauma. Rare internal injuries. The kind of cases that cost 3 times the standard rate and took 10 times the surgical hours. Victoria looked at him across the desk with a calm that he would come to recognize as her default setting, and she told him that every case would be evaluated on a cost-benefit basis going forward. That pre-authorization would be required for high-risk, high-cost interventions, that the hospital had to operate as a sustainable institution. Adrian drove home that night with his hands tight on the steering wheel. Over the following months, the conflict between them became a slow-moving landslide. It never exploded all at once. It built in layers, a case refused here, a form denied there, a meeting where Adrian pushed back, and Victoria listened with perfect patience, and then did exactly what she had already decided to do. There was a 43-year-old man with a ruptured hepatic artery who needed emergency intervention that the system had flagged as non-standard. Adrian performed it anyway. Victoria called him in the next morning and told him that what he had done had bypassed every protocol she had put in place. He told her the man would have been dead by morning if he had waited for authorization. She told him that was not the point. He told her that, to him, it was the only point. That conversation became the template for every conversation that followed. The staff noticed. The nurses, the residents, the anesthesiologists, who had worked alongside Adrian for years. They all felt the line being drawn down the center of the hospital. On one side, the way things had always been done. On the other, the way Victoria Halstead needed them to be done. Some people crossed the line quietly and without fanfare because they had bills and contracts and futures to protect. Adrian didn't cross it. He stood exactly where he had always stood and dared the institution to move him. It moved him on a Tuesday in October. Victoria's assistant called him to the director's office at 2 in the afternoon. He went without asking why, because he already knew. He had known for weeks the way you know a storm is coming, because the air changes before the clouds do. The office was quiet when he arrived. Victoria was seated at her desk, and she had a single folder open in front of her, and she didn't offer him a seat right away. When she did, she began speaking in the same measured tone. She always used the tone that had no room in it for argument or appeal. She told him that after a full review of his conduct over the past several months, the hospital had made the decision to end his employment, effective immediately. She used the word conduct twice. She said that he had demonstrated a consistent pattern of disregarding institutional protocols, that he had created liability exposure on multiple occasions, and that the culture he embodied was fundamentally incompatible with the direction the hospital needed to go. She slid a document across the desk, a termination agreement already prepared with a line at the bottom, waiting for his signature. Adrian looked at the paper for a long moment. Then he looked at her. 16 years, he said. I understand this is difficult, Victoria replied. He didn't sign anything. He stood up, walked to his locker, packed the items from his desk into a cardboard box, a stethoscope, a worn copy of a surgical reference text he had carried since residency, a photograph from a departmental event 5 years ago, and he walked out through the main entrance without saying goodbye to anyone, because he didn't trust himself to say the right things. The afternoon was cold and clear. Maple Avenue ran alongside the hospital campus for about 3 blocks before it opened up into a wider road with a strip of empty field on the right side. Adrian walked it slowly, the box under one arm, not thinking about anything in particular, and thinking about everything at once. 16 years. He had made his first solo trauma repair in that building. He had pulled people back from the edge in that building. He had been more himself inside those walls than anywhere else in his life, and now he was carrying it all in a cardboard box under a pale October sky, heading nowhere. He heard the helicopters before he saw them. The sound came from the south, a deep rhythmic percussion that grew fast, too fast for anything civilian. He turned and looked up just as 3 black helicopters cleared the tree line and descended in tight formation onto the empty field beside the road. The rotor wash hit him like a wall, scattering leaves and flattening the dry grass in wide circles. He stepped back, automatically, instinct overriding confusion. Before the rotors had even fully slowed, doors were sliding open. Men in dark, tactical clothing hit the ground and moved with the kind of practiced efficiency that didn't belong in a Tuesday afternoon on a quiet street in this part of the city. One of them was already coming straight toward Adrian, covering the ground between them in long, deliberate strides. He was broad across the shoulders, maybe mid-40s, with close-cropped gray hair and the expression of someone who had not slept recently and was operating entirely on urgency. He reached Adrian and grabbed his arm, not roughly, but with zero ambiguity about who was in charge of the next 30 seconds. "Are you Dr. Adrian Cole?" the man asked. Adrian looked at the grip on his arm, then at the man's face. "I am." "Marcus Webb," the man said, as if that explained anything. "I work for Garrison Blake." You know the name. Adrian knew the name. Everyone in the state knew the name. Garrison Blake had built a logistics and infrastructure empire over the past 3 decades that had reshaped half the regional economy. His name was on 2 hospital wings in neighboring counties, a research foundation, and about a dozen other things that required more money than most people could imagine. "Blake was in a vehicle accident 90 minutes ago," Marcus said, "already moving, already." Steering Adrian toward the nearest helicopter without quite waiting for an answer. "Internal trauma. Our medical team stabilized him on site, but he needs surgery. Our people tell us it's a hepatic and diaphragmatic injury with vascular involvement, and that there are maybe 4 surgeons in the state who have performed this specific repair under emergency conditions." Adrian didn't move toward the helicopter yet. Then call one of the other 3. We did. Marcus met his eyes directly. 2 are currently in surgery. 1 is in Europe. You're here. You're the one who's here. The man's voice didn't waver, but something in it acknowledged what it was asking. Dr. Cole, I know what happened this afternoon. I know you just walked out of that hospital, and I am standing here anyway, asking you. The rotors were still spinning. The field smelled like cut grass and jet fuel. Adrian looked down at the cardboard box in his arms, everything that was left of 16 years. And then he looked at the helicopter, and then he looked back at Marcus Webb's face. There was no calculation in what happened next. He didn't weigh his anger against his conscience or his pride against his training. It wasn't that complicated. It had never been that complicated. A man was bleeding out somewhere, and Adrian Cole was a trauma surgeon. That was the whole equation. He set the cardboard box down on the ground beside the road. Tell me everything you know about the injury on the way, he said, and walked toward the helicopter. The helicopter lifted before Adrian had fully buckled in. Marcus Webb sat across from him with a tablet already open, and for the next 11 minutes, which was how long the flight took, he spoke without stopping, laying out everything their medical team had documented at the scene. Vehicle collision on a rural highway, high-speed impact on the driver's side. Blake had been conscious at first, then deteriorated fast. The field team had gotten 2 large-bore IVs and pushed fluids, and kept him stable enough to transport. The imaging done at the site, portable ultrasound, limited but functional, showed free fluid in the abdomen, and what their physician suspected was a combined hepatic laceration and diaphragmatic tear, with involvement of at least 1 major vessel. Adrian listened without interrupting. He asked 2 questions. The first was about blood pressure trends over the 90 minutes since the accident. Marcus read the numbers from the tablet, and Adrian didn't like what he heard: a slow but consistent decline, that the fluids were only partially correcting, which meant the bleeding hadn't stopped. The second question was about what surgical resources would be available at the facility. Marcus told him that Blake maintained a private medical setup at his estate outside the city, a room that had been built to full surgical suite specifications after a health scare several years ago. Staff on retainer equipment, up-to-date, anesthesiologist already on site. Adrian looked out the window at the landscape moving beneath them and said nothing more for the rest of the flight. The estate came into view as the sun was dropping toward the tree line, a large property set back from a private road, the main house visible in the distance, but the helicopter descending toward a secondary structure closer to the landing pad. 2 people in scrubs were already waiting outside when the rotor slowed. Marcus moved quickly, and Adrian moved with him, and within 4 minutes of landing, he was inside and washing his hands at a scrub sink that was better equipped than half the hospitals he had rotated through during his residency. The anesthesiologist was a woman named Dr. Sandra Holt, composed, efficient, with the kind of quiet competence that Adrian recognized immediately as someone who had worked high-pressure cases before. She gave him a fast briefing on Blake's current status as he gowned up. Blood pressure was holding at the low end of acceptable. Heart rate elevated. 2 units of packed red cells already running. The portable CT. They had managed a compact machine that should not have existed outside a major medical center, but apparently did. When you had Garrison Blake's resources had confirmed what the ultrasound had suggested: a grade 4 hepatic laceration, a posterior diaphragmatic tear, and what appeared to be involvement of the right hepatic vein. Adrian read the images himself. He stood at the monitor for 90 seconds, not moving, taking in every slice of the scan with the focused attention of someone translating a language they had spent their entire career learning. When he turned away from the screen, his expression had not changed, but something behind his eyes had recalibrated. "This is more complex than what your team described in the field," he said to Sandra. "The venous involvement changes the approach. I need to know the exact volume of crystalloid they pushed before the blood products, and I need you to be prepared for significant intraoperative hemorrhage." Sandra had the numbers ready. She had, it became clear, already been thinking about the hemorrhage. "Understood," she said. "What's your plan?" "We control the hepatic bleeding first. Pack and assess the diaphragm. If the vein is lacerated rather than transected, we repair. If not, we manage and stabilize until he can be transferred to a full trauma center for definitive care." He looked at the two scrub technicians standing ready on the other side of the room. "Everyone clear on what we're doing?" They were. He went in. The first 40 minutes of the operation went the way Adrian had planned. He worked with the kind of economy that came from having done this long enough that his hands knew the moves before his mind had finished issuing the instructions. The hepatic laceration was severe. The imaging had not understated that, but the bleeding was controllable with the right technique and the right pressure, and he worked steadily, calling for instruments in a low, even voice, keeping the rhythm of the room calm, because a calm room made fewer mistakes. Sandra kept Blake's pressure in a range Adrian could work with. The technicians were good. For a private facility assembled under emergency conditions, the setup was better than it had any right to be. Then he reached the diaphragmatic tear. What the CT had shown as a clean posterior defect was in the direct view something considerably worse. The tear extended further laterally than the imaging had captured, and at its edge, right at the margin where the diaphragm met the vascular structures above, there was hemorrhage that had been partially tamponated by surrounding tissue. The moment Adrian's instrument disturbed that margin, the tamponade released. "Pressure drop," Sandra said, her voice controlled but immediate. "Systolic falling. 88. Adrian did not look up. "Suction. I need a clear field. Now." The next several minutes compressed into the particular kind of time that only exists inside an operating room, when something has gone wrong and every second is a decision. The bleeding was significant, not catastrophic, yet but moving in that direction with purpose. The right hepatic vein was involved exactly as he had feared, and the access was complicated by the position of the tear and the swelling in the surrounding tissue. He called for a different retractor. He repositioned. He made a judgment call about the angle of approach that was not in any textbook, because the situation on the table was not in any textbook. "Systolic at 79, Sandra reported. One of the scrub technicians, a younger man named Ryan, who had been steady all night, shifted his weight and said too quietly for it to be a statement, and too loudly for it to be just a thought. "We might need to consider." "We're not stopping," Adrian said, not harshly, just with complete finality. "Push the second unit faster. Sandra, I need his pressure back above 90, and I need 3 minutes." "Working on it," Sandra said. The room held that particular quality of silence that has nothing to do with the absence of sound monitors, beeping instruments, moving the ventilator cycling, and everything to do with the absence of certainty. Everyone in that room was doing their job, and simultaneously watching a man hover at the edge of something irreversible, and there was nothing anyone could do about it, except the person with his hands inside the chest cavity. Adrian was aware of all of it. He was aware of the pressure numbers Sandra was calling out, aware of Ryan's tension on the other side of the table, aware of the fact that Marcus Webb was somewhere outside that door, waiting on a result that Adrian could not promise. And somewhere underneath all of that awareness, like a sound coming through a wall, he could hear Victoria Halstead's voice from that morning. Not the specific words. He had stopped listening carefully to the specific words somewhere around month 3 of their conflict, but the tone. The tone that said he was the problem. That the way he worked, the way he made decisions, the weight he gave to what happened on that table over what appeared on a spreadsheet, that all of it was the problem. That he did not fit. He had spent 16 years fitting himself to that operating room, to the particular demands of the moment when a person was losing their grip on being alive and someone had to be the thing that held. He pushed the voice back and he looked at the field in front of him. The right hepatic vein had a partial laceration, not a full transection. That mattered. A full transection at that location without a full surgical team and a perfusionist and a bypass circuit was not survivable in this room. A partial laceration repaired with precision and speed was a different conversation. He had done it before, once years ago in a county hospital, with less equipment and worse lighting, and a patient who had walked out of the ICU 11 days later and sent him a handwritten note he had kept in his desk until this morning. The note was in the cardboard box on Maple Avenue now. He focused on the vein. The access was terrible. The angle was wrong. He asked for a different needle driver, adjusted his grip, and began the repair with the kind of deliberate steadiness that had nothing to do with confidence and everything to do with the refusal to let his hands betray what his mind knew how to do. Systolic is 82, Sandra said. Holding. Good. Keep it there. The repair took 9 minutes. 9 minutes of suturing at a depth and angle that should have required a team twice the size in a facility 10 times more equipped. Adrian worked without commentary, without asking for reassurance, without looking at the monitors more than necessary, because looking at the monitors was Sandra's job, and doing his job was his job. He placed the final suture. He checked the line. He irrigated, looked at the field for a long moment. The bleeding had stopped. Not slowed. Stopped. Pressure, he said. 89 and climbing, Sandra said, and there was something in her voice that had not been there before. Not relief exactly, but the first movement toward it. Heart rate coming down. He's responding. Adrian moved to the diaphragm. The lateral extension of the tear needed to be closed, and he did it methodically, layer by layer, with the same economy he had brought to every other step. The room had changed. Ryan had stopped shifting his weight. The second technician, who had not spoken once during the entire procedure, exhaled audibly enough that the sound carried. Sandra ran her numbers quietly and steadily, and the numbers were moving in the right direction. It took another 35 minutes to close. When it was done, and the final dressing was placed, and Sandra had confirmed that Blake's vitals were stabilizing into a range that looked for the first time all evening like something a person could sustain, Adrian stepped back from the table. He stripped his outer gloves. He looked at the monitor one more time, pressure holding heart rate, settling oxygen saturation recovering, and then he looked at no one in particular and said nothing. There was nothing that needed to be said inside that room. The result was the statement. He walked to the scrub sink, ran cold water over his hands, and stood there for a moment with his eyes closed and the sound of the monitors bleeding through the door behind him. Outside, he knew Marcus Webb was waiting. Blake's family was probably there by now, or would be soon. There would be questions about next steps, about transfer to a proper facility for continued care, about what happened from here. All of that was real, and all of it would need to be handled. But in that moment, standing at the sink with cold water running over his hands, Adrian Cole was only aware of one thing. Somewhere on Maple Avenue, there was a cardboard box sitting on the ground in the dark, and he had left it there without looking back. And somehow, in a way that he couldn't have anticipated when he set it down, that felt exactly right. Marcus Webb was standing in the hallway when Adrian came through the door. He had his arms crossed and his back against the wall, and the way he straightened when he saw Adrian's face told Adrian that the man had been doing this long enough to read an outcome before it was spoken. "He's stable," Adrian said. "The hepatic repair held. The diaphragm is closed. His pressure was climbing when I left the room." He kept his voice level the same way he always delivered post-operative status, factual, direct, without the inflation that families sometimes needed and medical colleagues never did. "He needs to be transferred to a full trauma center within the next several hours for monitoring and continued care. The repair is solid, but this is not the environment for his recovery." Marcus nodded, slowly absorbing it. Then something in the man's composure shifted, not dramatically, Not the way it happens in films, just a small release of tension around the jaw and eyes that indicated an enormous amount of pressure had just been removed from a very specific point. "I'll make the call," he said. "St. Raphael's in the city has a trauma ICU. We have a relationship there." "Good. Sandra should ride with him. She knows his intraoperative course better than anyone you'd hand him off to cold." "Understood." Marcus looked at Adrian for a moment, with the kind of directness that wasn't quite gratitude yet, because gratitude required time to become fully formed. "Is there anything you need right now?" Adrian thought about it honestly. "A chair," he said. "And some water." They found him both in a small room off the main corridor, a sitting room that had the feel of a space designed for waiting, with good chairs and low lighting, and a window that looked out onto the dark grounds of the estate. Someone brought water and a plate of food that Adrian didn't remember requesting, but ate anyway, because he had been on his feet for the better part of 4 hours, and his body had opinions about that. He sat alone and let the quiet settle around him, which was something he had always been able to do after a surgery. Let the sustained concentration of the operating room drain out slowly, like water finding its level. He thought about the case with the clinical part of his mind, still running, checking and rechecking the decisions he had made. The repair, the approach, the 9 minutes on the hepatic vein. That was normal. That was what you did. You ran it again after the fact, not because you doubted it, but because the discipline of review was what kept the next case cleaner than the last. He found nothing he would change. The conditions had been what they were, and the decisions had been the right ones for those conditions, and Garrison Blake was alive because of it. He sat with that for a while, and it felt neither triumphant nor hollow. It felt more than anything like the simple completion of a thing that had needed to be completed. The news moved faster than the helicopter. By the time Adrian had finished eating and the transfer arrangements were being finalized, Blake was moved to street. Raphael's just after midnight stable and sedated, with Sandra Holt, accompanying as agreed word, had already begun to travel through the particular channels that words travel through when they involve powerful people and unlikely circumstances. By morning, the story had a shape that the people telling it found irresistible. The surgeon fired that afternoon by his hospital director had been pulled off the street by helicopters and had saved the life of Garrison Blake before the day was out. Adrian did not learn most of this from a phone call or a news alert. He learned it the way private information becomes public knowledge, gradually through the reactions of other people. Marcus Webb, who was not given to unnecessary conversation, mentioned at around 2 in the morning that Dr. Sandra Holt had spoken with the receiving team at St. Raphael's and that the case had already generated significant discussion in the trauma surgery community. One of the attending physicians there apparently had recognized the specifics of the repair and described it to a colleague as something he had not seen executed outside a major academic center. By the time Adrian was being driven back toward the city in one of Blake's vehicles, his phone had more missed calls on it than it had accumulated in the previous month combined. He did not return any of them that night. He watched the city lights come up through the window and let the phone sit in his pocket, and he thought about the cardboard box. It was still there, presumably on Maple Avenue, or it wasn't because someone had moved it, or the wind had turned it over, or any number of unremarkable things had happened to an unremarkable box sitting on a sidewalk in the dark. He wasn't sure why it kept coming back to him, that image of the box on the pavement. Maybe because it was the most honest picture of where he had been 12 hours ago. Standing on a public street with everything he had built, packed into a container that a person could carry under one arm. He had set it down, he had walked away from it, and he had gone and done the only thing he actually knew how to do. It was 4 days later that Marcus Webb called and asked if Adrian would be willing to meet with Blake's family. Blake himself was still in the ICU at St. Raphael's. Improving the reports said, though, recovery from that level of injury was measured in weeks and months rather than days. His wife, Eleanor Blake, had been at the hospital since the night of the accident, and it was she who had made the request. The meeting happened in a private lounge on the 4th floor of St. Raphael's, the kind of room that existed for conversations that required privacy and a certain amount of quiet. Eleanor Blake was a composed woman in her early 60s, with silver hair and the kind of steady presence that suggested she had spent a long time learning how to hold herself upright under weight. She thanked Adrian directly and without ornamentation, which he appreciated because elaborate gratitude always made him uncomfortable. She asked a few questions about the surgery, about what recovery would look like, about what Garrison would be able to do, and when. He answered them as honestly as he could. Then she told him why she had really asked him to come. She said that her husband over the years had spoken often about the state of emergency medicine in the region, about the gaps, the facilities that were underfunded, the cases that fell through because the right resources weren't in the right place. She said that he had considered more than once making a significant investment in building something new, a trauma center built from the ground up, with the philosophy that the quality of care should not be determined by a patient's insurance tier or the cost-benefit calculus of a hospital administrator. She said that what had happened 4 days ago, the specific nature of it, the fact that the surgeon best equipped to save her husband's life had been removed from his position that same morning, precisely because he refused to let those calculations govern his decisions, had made the question feel less abstract than it ever had before. "We want to build it," Eleanor said. "A trauma and emergency center, properly funded, properly staffed with the kind of independence that means the people running it make decisions based on medicine." She looked at him steadily. "We want to know if you would lead it." Adrian sat with that for a moment. Outside the window, the city moved at its ordinary pace. Traffic, pedestrians, the indifferent rhythm of a Thursday morning. He thought about the conversation he had had with Victoria Halstead in that glass-walled office, the folder on the desk, the word conduct used twice. He thought about the form sitting across from him, waiting for a signature he never gave. He thought about the 43-year-old man with the ruptured hepatic artery who had sent him a handwritten note, and the note sitting in a cardboard box on Maple Avenue, and whether the box was still there. He thought about what it would mean to build something where the rule he had always operated by, if a person is still breathing when they come through that door, your job is to make sure they keep breathing, was not a source of conflict, but the founding principle. "What kind of timeline are you thinking?" he asked. Eleanor Blake allowed herself something close to a smile. "As fast as we can do it properly," she said, "which I understand from people who know these things, is not as fast as we'd like, but faster than you might expect." Adrian nodded. "I'd need to be involved in the design from the beginning, the operational structure, the staffing philosophy, the protocols, all of it. That's the only way we'd want to do it," she said. He told her he would think about it, because that was the honest answer. Not because he was uncertain, but because he was someone who did not commit to things in the room before he had given them the weight they deserved. He took the drive home to think, and he thought about it the way he thought about surgical plans, methodically, without sentiment, looking for the flaws in the approach before committing to the approach. He didn't find any. 3 days after the meeting, he called Marcus Webb and told him yes. Marcus said he'd expected that answer and had already told Eleanor as much. Adrian told him not to do that again, and Marcus said he'd try. The cardboard box, it turned out, had been found by a Parks Department worker early Wednesday morning, sitting undisturbed on the edge of Maple Avenue. The worker, not finding any identification, had brought it to the city's Lost and Found office where it sat for 10 days before Adrian retrieved it. The stethoscope was still there. The surgical reference text was still there. The handwritten note from the man with the ruptured hepatic artery still there, folded to a softness that came from having been opened and reread more times than Adrian would have admitted, was still there. He took the box home to the apartment on Fletcher Street and unpacked it for the last time and put the note somewhere he would not lose it, because it belonged to a version of his life he intended to carry forward, rather than leave behind. 16 years in one institution had taught him to be the best version of himself within a system that had eventually run out of room for what he was. That wasn't failure, or it was, but it was the kind that clarified rather than diminished. Victoria Halstead had looked at him across a desk and told him he didn't fit. And she had been right in the only way that mattered. He didn't fit inside a structure that weighed a human life against a ledger entry and called that medicine. What she hadn't understood, what the termination agreement and the prepared folder and the measured tone had not accounted for, was that not fitting was not the same as not belonging. He belonged exactly where his training and his instincts and his 16 years of refusing to let a person die when he could prevent it had always been pointing him. Somewhere in the city, in a building that did not yet exist, there were people who would come through a door in the worst moments of their lives. They wouldn't know his name. They wouldn't know what had happened on a Tuesday afternoon on Maple Avenue, or what a cardboard box had to do with any of it. They would only know that someone met them in that doorway, and that the only question that mattered was the one Adrian Cole had been answering his whole career. What do you need? And how do we keep you alive? Everything else was details.